Une bombe de drone vient de frapper l'aéroport.
Well, barely 4 days have passed since the signing of that peace deal between the DRC and Rwanda that happened in Washington, D.C., overseen by the President of the United States, Donald Trump. Today, that same peace deal is under strain. An airplane was downed in eastern DRC. On one side, the M23 says that this plane was carrying humanitarian aid, while on the other side, the FARDC, the Kinshasa government, says that this plane did not have the authorization to be in Congolese airspace. Well, in this video, I'm going to tell you about those two sides, what these two parties are saying, and how this fragile peace deal is now being tested before we start the Doha talks. Well, this is Bonafide. If you haven't subscribed, kindly subscribe and hit that notification button so that when I release something new on the Eastern DRC crisis, you get notified as soon as possible. Well, the FARDC bombed a plane in Eastern DRC that has really angered the M23. The spokesperson of the M23, Lawrence Kanyuka, wrote a communique to the public that read that nearly 72 hours after signing a peace agreement in Washington, the murderous Kinshasa regime has once again committed an act of unspeakable barbarity by bombing on Monday, June 30th, 2025, a civilian aircraft transporting humanitarian aid destined for Minembwe, South Kivu. This heinous crime, premeditated and executed with tremendous cruelty, extended beyond human casualties. It also destroyed essential supplies, including medicines. It reduced to ashes food rations intended for a disaster-stricken population traumatized by violence orchestrated by the Kinshasa regime since April 2017. Through this latest atrocity, the Kinshasa regime implements its vile ethnic cleansing campaigns against our Banyamulenge compatriots. It deliberately condemns them to protracted suffering while fueling an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe in Minembwe. The Alliance Fleuve Congo AFC M23 condemns in the strongest possible terms this flagrant, cynical, and repeated ceasefire violation by the illegitimate regime of Kinshasa, along with coordinated attacks against civilians in densely populated areas of Kanyola, Kabare, Kigogo, Kadasomwa, Nyabiondo, and their environs, perpetrated jointly with the Burundian National Defense Forces, FDLR, and Wazalendo militias. These targeted massacres of our compatriots Banyamulenge will not go unpunished and must stop immediately. Well, that is the harsh statement released by the M23, and in the last paragraph, the M23 notes that that particular act by the FARDC bombing that plane will not go unanswered, meaning that the M23 will prepare for a rebuttal or an attack against the FARDC to pay off what the FARDC has done to that plane. Well, on the other side, the FARDC confirmed that it downed that particular plane, and they say that this aircraft violated our airspace and entered Congolese territory illegally without prior authorization, and after verification it was found to have no registration marking, and that the Congolese army says that it was a national security matter and that plane had to be downed because it was going to an active conflict zones. These are the demarcation lines between where the FARDC starts and where the M23 starts, active conflict zones where both of these militaries are holding their grounds. Therefore, the FARDC says that this plane was going to these areas and they saw that as a risk to them, as a national security risk. Perhaps they had in mind that this plane was carrying ammunition for the M23, and maybe that is the reason as to why the FARDC chose to down that plane. Well, this now marks the largest security crisis after the signing of that peace deal. We are now seeing that both of these parties still have very hard grounds against each other. It is as if there was no peace deal signed, because the M23 is here saying that it will respond to that aggression by the Kinshasa government. And the Kinshasa regime is also firmly holding to its ground, saying that this plane did not have the authorization needed and it had to be downed. Well, this, of course, coming right now before the Doha talks, is going to break the trust that the M23 has on the Kinshasa government to hold its part of the bargain, because we thought that this could be a moment of peace before we enter the Doha talks, where the M23 is going to actively engage the Kinshasa government. But this act right now is going to change the entire dynamics of how both of these parties are going to approach the talks in Doha to find a sustainable peace for Eastern DRC. It is an act that has seriously contradicted the spirit of the Washington deal, because the Washington deal was to create this kind of an environment that will now push both of these parties to go and have a talk and cement the entire deal from Washington to Doha. But as we can see it right now, the FDLR have also been mentioned by the M23. That communique has been very, very precisely written. If you go through it again, you'll find that the M23 has been very meticulous in writing specific targets and specific people who are involved in these attacks. The Burundian National Defense Forces have been mentioned in that particular communique. The FDLR have been mentioned in that particular communique. The FDLR is the group that was specifically mentioned by Rwanda as a threat to the Rwandan regime. Now, the M23 has also mentioned the FDLR as part of the attacks that are continuing in Eastern DRC. Of course, now this continues to raise questions, because if Rwanda is going to pull troops and the FDLR is still active in Eastern DRC, then what was the purpose of the deal in Washington? How is it going to be implemented if we are still having these militias and groups very active in Eastern DRC? And as I said, that particular communique was meticulously written by the M23. They have put it as a humanitarian catastrophe, that this plane was carrying humanitarian aid and it was downed by the Kinshasa regime. Of course, this is going to garner some international sympathy that will go, of course, to the side of the M23, and it will also go ahead to justify a continued military presence in the so-called liberated areas by the M23. That is the importance of that public communique that was released by Lawrence Kanyuka, the spokesperson of the M23, to first of all make it a humanitarian issue, that the FARDC is bombing a humanitarian plane, and then that has now given them the justification to continue to hold fast. And they've also put in the ethnic factor into it, the Banyamulenge coming in, that these are the people who are going to be supported by this humanitarian aid, and now this plane has been downed. Now it seems as if the Kinshasa government is against the Banyamulenge by downing this plane. Of course, these are going to have public sentiments coming against the Kinshasa government because of their actions to down this particular plane. Of course, this now points to a military escalation, and the M23 now has a public rationale to retaliate militarily for self-defense and protection of the Banyamulenge as victims in all these, as well as this has now put more strain to the United States and Qatar being the host of these two deals. One, the deal that has been signed by Washington, and the Doha talks that will proceed to a deal between the M23 and the Kinshasa government. Both of these deals have to work. If one deal of these two deals is not working, the entire thing does not work. They depend on each other. Because the Doha talks now involves the M23 and the Kinshasa government, this has to work for there to be some semblance of peace in Eastern DRC. The Rwanda and DRC deal also has to work for there to be some semblance of peace in Eastern DRC. So without both of these deals working, then there will not be peace in Eastern DRC as envisioned by the US and Qatar. Well, I will continue to keep you informed of the latest of what is happening in Eastern DRC. If the United States and Qatar will issue public statements regarding the downing of that plane, as well as how the M23 will respond to that kind of aggression from the Kinshasa government. Keep it bona fide.